Right, I'm going to begin. Let's get to it. So hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar event on representation and inclusive design in digital art. I'm Carmela, one of the team at Zealous, and I'm here today with Bethan, who is also one of the team at Zealous. And we usually host these type of conversations on Instagram Live, but today we wanted to do things a little bit differently and hop over onto this team's webinar to talk to a very special guest. And today's guest is Creative Director of CIEDA, who is James Wheeler. And as you may have read in the event description, James is the founder of two creative competitions, the Pareto Prize and Huluku, which we'll talk about more shortly. James is passionate about inclusion and authentic representation, and we hope that today we can create broader conversations around these topics to investigate how we can navigate them and ways in which we can strive to create a more diverse and inclusive world through digital art and beyond.
James is also kindly judging our shortlist round for our creative competition called Zealous Amplify. So this Amplify is a competition based on themes around mental health and well-being, which has seen poets, visual artists, filmmakers, creative writers, sculptors, musicians and more to submit their work. We had 581 submissions in total, and judging is currently taking place to select our long list. Selected artists will form part of our first virtual exhibition, which will launch on October the 10th.
I'm excited for this exhibition.
Me too.
James, as part of this, hello firstly.
Thanks for having me.
No worries, of course. What are you expecting to see as part of the judging process for Amplify, and what are you hoping to take away from it? I just wanted to ask that question before we begin.
I think it's judging is extremely difficult, and having done lots of my own, it kind of comes down to a lot of what you kind of trying to keep as open-minded as possible about what you're expected to see. And often with Huluku, particularly from last year and the Pareto Prize, I often sit there thinking, gosh, am I actually even able to the right person to judge these things and for other people? So I think, in answer to your question, not going to go in with any expectations at all, just keep my mind open and be as relaxed and open to the ideas and what people are putting across.
I love being receptive to whatever is going on as well. It can be really exciting. You might see something that you just didn't even anticipate, and it could inspire something new.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there probably will be some things we'd just be sitting there going, gosh, I didn't even know, well, that's an interesting style or interpretation change, which should be exciting.
And we are very happy to have you as part of our judging panel. It's great to get so many different diverse voices going through all our entries. So now we should actually get a proper start into our live talk today. And what we usually do to start off these talks is ask the question, what's on your mind right now?
So right now, I think from what I've been kind of looking at is something called DALL-E 2, the AI generated art. And what's kind of really struck me with this is, and it's the guy behind LinkedIn, Rusev, who's making kind of headway, and I think Elon might be involved in this somewhere too. So that could go either way then. And what's really interesting is that it's already being accused of bias because what it's doing, it's learning from existing content that it sees and reads online, which we know already isn't necessarily the most perfect place. So if the content is already biased or lacking representation, then the results are likely to be art that brings the sort of things that we're essentially on here today to talk about and really want to eliminate, but they're still here. And then there's the query over how the noticeable bias works in the themes of Huluku as well. So I was then thinking about whether Huluku is impacted by the prize or the prize is impacted by the type of the art and whether something from DALL-E 2 would count as an entry. But on the flip side is obviously the bias, and then on the other flip side is this idea of people like me who are less good at drawing, and my handwriting is rubbish. So if you've got less capability, then you can put things together that are going to be unique and interesting. So that's cool. Also for people with dexterity issues, being able to speak, and perhaps they could evolve this into sign language or Makaton, which is pictograms. So that could be really interesting. And then my final thought, which it's quite expansive, I know, but the AI designers, how are they managing their bias when they're creating things that machines. So maybe kind of as we look to technology and AI as to manage a lot more of our biases automatically, can we get AI that can control the biases of designers of AI? I'm sure this stuff's been talked about, but I thought DALL-E 2 sounds interesting.
Yeah, DALL-E 2 is a really interesting software, and I recommend anyone who's not had a look at it to give it a look, because you can definitely create some really interesting images using it. Carmela, what's on your mind right now?
I haven't really thought about this question too much today. Like, to go from one extreme to the other, I've not really been thinking about that much, except I'm just quite happy that the weather's cooling down. So, yeah, that's me, really. What about you, Bethan?
I think it's just exciting how much is happening at Amplify at the moment. We're coming to the end of our very first round of judging, so we're making our first lot of selections at the end of this week and the start of next week, which is like really exciting, and we can get a start on the exhibition. It's going to be a lot of work, but I'm looking forward to putting it all together and seeing all of the works in one space.
Definitely very exciting. So, before we get into the nitty-gritty of things, James, please could you tell us more about CIEDA? I'm just thinking, for the people who might not have heard of you before, what does your organisation do, and who are the types of people that you help?
Yeah, no surprise that you may not have heard of us. We are relatively small scale in comparison, but so in essence, we're a creative change agency, and we're also not-for-profit. So what we do is we kind of look at how we can make money to then funnel into our not-for-profit work. And to make money, we look at specialised inclusion training. That might be kind of helping people with bias, helping people with, we talk about idea canvas later, and also then creative brand marketing services to generate profit, which then leads into the non-profit stuff, which I can tell you about now if you like as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. So I used to come from an physical access and inclusion background. So I kind of started getting to the point where I was fed up with seeing my life kind of drip into remediation. This building is old and it needs to change. But meanwhile, there were a lot of people who were putting up new buildings, which I was like, I'm going to have to fix that in like 25 years if this stays. So what I wanted to do was move into something that can influence our creative decision makers in a more positive way before they got to the stage where other pressures would result in bad design. So CIEDA works with that power source, which we determine to be the higher education, researcher and academic. So in a nutshell, what we do is we help academics across any field, but especially within inclusive design or related subjects, to bring their idea to the front lines of either the consultancy, if you're an activist, if you're someone who's working in a local council, and basically incubating and accelerating it through branding or project and change implementation. The sort of thing that we'd all want someone to kind of drop in and say, aha, do you know what? I can help you with that. You focus on the idea, I'll get the plates and I'll lay the table. So what we also kind of want to target, and as we get more and more money through, is looking at who's excluded from these groups to bringing their ideas to the market. So this might look like people involved in STEAM subjects, so science, technology, engineering, arts, architecture, and maths. And then they can bring these things called CRISPs, so concepts, research, ideas, solutions, products, and services, and another acronym. And the idea is you have your packet of crisps, and then we see how we can draw this out for people. So we're combating groupthink, homogenous ideas, and plugging all these great ideas that essentially form the underpin what we do as a consultancy. And that's struggling to get noticed, but are all vital. And for people who may not understand how to get funding, perhaps we can fund them entirely, or indeed help them to source funding. So it's, in a nutshell, what ideas in higher academia and research are sitting there waiting to change the world, but just need that identity and help to bring out.
You sound like a really great resource for people and kind of like the foundations of what people want to build on, and I feel like you can really help with that. I also love the acronym CRISPs.
That's all I was thinking.
Well, if anyone's from America, because I was thinking about the chips, so maybe there's an acronym for chips as well, so you can have chips and crisps. I'm sure there's something there. Good to think.
Yeah, you do some really amazing work, and it's great to hear a bit more about it. And for those who don't know, you actually currently have an opportunity on Zealous for creatives to enter until the 30th of September. It's a competition, it's called Huluku, and the purpose of the competition is to create a big shift in the realm of digital art, which will make diverse and inclusive images the mainstream. You're striving to dismantle the need for an independent, inclusive and diverse stock library. So my question is, why is the competition called Huluku, and why did you decide to create Huluku in the first place?
So I'll deal with the first one. So both relatively easy to answer, but are great questions. And so Dungay Kivuitu, who is a non-exec director of CIEDA, is originally from Kenya, and she sort of helped us inspire this word create, which is the word for in Swahili. So what we were looking for was something that really kind of said nice one word that people could kind of go, oh, what's that? Get interested in from a branding perspective, but at the same time have something that meant something to us as well. And so that's where Huluku comes from. Plus I like saying it as well. It's quite a nice, smooth word. And so it's good. And I think in answer to your second question, Bethan, there was back in 2020, and we're going to talk about another bit of a Spanish government scandal later, but the first one that's worth talking about is this idea of the UK government. And what they did, they made a little poster, and it had 4 little houses, and in each of these scenes were characters, female characters and male characters, and the females happened to be doing all the housework or looking after the family, and the male character happened to have feet up and this. So there was a right uproar about it at the time, and this occurred just at the moment where I was thinking a lot about how stock libraries don't really service the needs of the company owner or the producer or the agency in the way that I really wanted to happen. And then started working on this theme of, well, why do we even have to have stock libraries which are diverse? Why do I even have to make these searches? Why is there a choice of 30 pictures versus 3,000 million? And so what Huluku is essentially designed to is to start people thinking about building authentic representation and these ideas into their virtual stock libraries and illustrations, so that we effectively eliminate, and everything that you see on a stock library becomes the sort of thing that we can use and build on. So I wanted Huluku to be that catalyst for exciting new thinking, inspire people to express and interpret in their way, and kind of manage biases at the same time as we become more conscious of them. So we can only manage our biases if we really spend time looking at what digital artists do and working out how we can include in a diversity of ways as well. And so an idea of this about how to show equity and independence would be something like push bikes or cycles. A lot of the time when you're in stock libraries, there's 2-wheel cycles, but there's lots of different types, a lot of different needs. So where's the equity in just 2-wheel cycles? Why not show more choice around that? So that's one of the tips and hints in Huluku itself. And finally, what I really wanted to push was this idea of building a collaborative building, a shared vocabulary as well. So if we all imagine all of everyone on the call and whoever's waiting there, imagine we're part of like a ninja team, maybe an elite team like the US President's Bodyguard, or perhaps a classroom team at a school for children with complex needs. But today we're going to be in a surgical suite and we're all wearing masks, everything's restricted and tight. So it's tough to see who's who and be heard and make that kind of coordination. The risk is we do a life-saving job. So they have to operate in their role with a precise vocabulary, this shared experience that everyone can work from. So effective comms and language is critical and should be included in both explicit, so we're talking like CSR, corporate social responsibility, brand and marketing, company handbooks, and the implicit behaviours through inclusive behaviours led primarily by inclusive decision making. Now, it makes sense that we create this new language together and then help it evolve into something meaningful. And that's the real core of what I wanted Huluku to help out with.
That's amazing. And then for anyone who is interested in entering Huluku, I've just dropped the link to opportunity into the chat of this call.
Thanks, Bethan. That's great.
That is really great. And it's kind of like this shared vocabulary that you talk about, which we're never really kind of taught. I could never think of like a specific moment in my life, especially like things in schools and stuff where you think you'd learn about everything. This kind of stuff is still evolving. And I feel like it can't just be instilled like in schools. We have to work on these things now. And like through this opportunity, through Huluku, that is like the catalyst for the change that you're talking about. I think it's a really, really great way of kind of getting things into motion a little bit more.
We talk a little bit about, in some of the later questions, about the subtle change and how everything's got to be gently evolving. And I come from an access perspective where it's normally legislation and guidance, but the creative world can often be whatever's in someone's imagination. And I found that really interesting, kind of to how to balance that as I went through this.
Yeah, so you mentioned the scandal that saw like this patriarchal kind of household. I did want to touch on the Spanish scandal that you did touch on. I wanted to explain a little bit about what's going on for everyone and then see what we could do about it. But I wanted to further discuss the topic of authentic representation specifically. And this scandal saw the Spanish Ministry of Equality hire an illustrator to create a body positivity campaign. And it was the image that they created and the illustration that they created was based on actual social media influencers without their consent, including the likes of Sean Green Lord, Naomi Nicholas Williams and Juliet Fitzpatrick. And not only did the creator of this image use their images without consent, but they also augmented some of their bodies. So Sean had her prosthetic leg edited out and replaced with an able-bodied leg. And Juliet, who has a double mastectomy, had her face edited onto another person's body. And obviously this is quite highly problematic, especially for the people involved, but for everyone else who has the perspective of them. So what is kind of your take on all of that, and how can we learn from an incident like this? How can we take that experience and kind of educate people around representation?
So it's a great description, Carmela, there. So, but you really kind of summarise the kind of the core issues. So it was really, really bad in my view. Because it's pretending to accept people, but behind the scenes, there's kind of that manipulation, isn't there, around, it doesn't say acceptance and equity. Instead, it says, oh, we'll just have the bits of you that we think are okay. And it's kind of become a bit of a layered sandwich of classic social exclusionary behaviours and disgraceful on lots of different levels. But even down to where the minister who's responsible for the in Spain said on release of this poster, so all bodies are valid, and we have the right to enjoy life as we are without guilt or shame. So indeed, that I think is the ultimate aim. And when you take that as a concept, there's a lot of good intent in this particular piece of work. And I think as we, and hopefully I'll show this as we talk through this particular piece, that whilst the campaign ends up sending the wrong message entirely, it's a great example of how badly things can go wrong with reputational risk. The root of it to do the right thing was there. It's just, as I think Naomi says on one of the websites, bad execution. But there's a route to this execution as well, which I think is worth us discovering. And one of the questions that kind of came out of this was, why was the Spanish government in later like press releases so intent on focusing on the breaking of the rights imagery and font typeface by the team responsible, when they're now branding them as amateurs? And I didn't actually feel that this was necessarily just about image rights. And I'd rather a discussion had stayed around the creative choices that were made at the time, because I think there's a lot more of core down there. So one of those kind of key questions is, well, how much of this was driven by the client to make changes? And who saw the drafts, approvals? And was this artist, Massive Peach, I think, was the artist very much beck call of the client, or was this the case where the art turned up and was the case, oh, wonderful, brilliant, let's roll on? And then there's a kind of the challenge of where does the artist or the designer have to consider everything for the client? So, or is there a vice versa here? So this is the question of blending the creativity with regulation and then the creative constraint. And which I mentioned earlier is quite a big thing, because if you've got someone saying, oh, you can't operate in this particular line, a lot of artists may go, oh, well, I'm definitely going to do it then. Or there might be a lot of people who say, well, okay, I want to do this, but I don't actually understand. So you can see, even with rules and regulations, mistakes are extremely common, as the UK government example shows. So the root cause of this is broader than necessarily just image rights. And it could even come down to something simple where when you use Adobe Illustrator, you often will use a photograph or something as a support and then draw the shapes from that. So it could be that the picture is inspiration, and then that's just led to this. So one mistake is then cascaded. But what then is also interesting is that no one's actually talking about the accessibility of the font family either. And so the font family is interesting because there's a big campaign for when you're talking about between sans serifs and serifs. So if you've got big curly fonts and how difficult they are for a lot of people to see. And even for me, and I don't necessarily, I've got dyslexia, but it doesn't impact on the reading too much. But I look at that and I don't read Spanish, but there's still a visual issue of trying to absorb what that messaging is. So even if everything had gone right, there still would have been an observation to be made about why was the font chosen? What about the color scheme? Does the dark brown work for people? And it's this sort of exploration I think is key. But having said that, Huluku is a safe place to observe the work of others and explore what that authentic representation of digital art means and how to do it better as well. So it's about still keeping in with the vision. And it's not perfect, but it hopefully reflects the right behaviours that clients will be asking now from all designers and creatives. And I think it's about everyone learning and feeling confident and moving on and identifying that there's something to change here and transform positively.
It's really interesting how you pick up on the font as well, because that's not something that would have necessarily captured my attention because there was just so much going on elsewhere with the image rights, and it's kind of like a distraction in a way for the font. But yeah, how can we kind of like, I think the issue with this kind of scandal is that there was a lack of transparency as well from the people who designed it. They kind of like issue apologies, but then it doesn't really go further than that. We don't really get down into actually what did go wrong and how could we learn from it as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I suspect with this particular example, there would be nothing further coming out of it. Hopefully there will be over time, and hopefully, but as we'll discuss in a moment as well, this is impactful on lots of different people. And it could potentially be one of those where we can talk and we can discuss creatively about how to make evolutions and how to start thinking about things. That's the challenge. To make things more positive off the back of the mistakes that we make.
Definitely, because something like this not only impacts the people whose images were taken and manipulated, but it also impacts those who now when they see the image, they can't see themselves represented in it. Originally, if they'd have kept the images as they were, regardless of whether they were stolen or not, the other people could have seen themselves in this work, and now they're completely removed from it and may feel quite isolated that they don't get to see themselves represented, not just in this, but in lots of media. There are so many places where people can't find a connection to the work. So in a way, what kind of impact do you think these scandals have on people's mental health?
So this is a good question, and I think it directly relates out of that. And it's where I wanted to kind of just take the discussion was around the well-documented issues of social exclusion. And social exclusion directly impacts on mental health issues through isolation, loneliness, lower self-esteem and anxiety. It can be as simple as this concept of visitability, which is popular in the States and is growing in the UK, with this idea that everyone should be able to have access. So for instance, if there's a friend who has mobility impairment how do they join you for a coffee or vice versa? And how do you get people spending money in town centres if they can't use pavements because people park cars on them or grow holly bushes, which is a remarkable achievement in my area. But don't get me started down that line. We're talking about other things. And so what social exclusion actually does is cause pain, actual physical pain. And mental illness can then have a new addition to this cycle as well. So it impacts on work, access to social protection, access to services. And so what we're essentially doing here is by this product, this poster, is adding and creating and then adding to cycles of exclusion. And we all have a duty to break, or at least not make these cycles of exclusion in the first place, but we definitely have a duty to break them. And that could be simple as including someone in a game of football at school. And so when we're thinking about poor representation and how that affects people generally, I guess it kind of is that I can't see it, so maybe I can't be it. And that idea of non-acceptance, which you hit on there, Bethan, feeling socially excluded, which everyone's felt at one time or another. So we can all understand that feeling. But we're often also in turn responsible for creating and feeding elements about ourselves through our decision making. So it's, I guess, the things that we could think about, things like the well-being of the people who had their images, which you mentioned. Being put under a global microscope must be quite intense, regardless. And then there's the explicit who you are isn't good enough. And even though we're celebrating this, but it's still not good enough. And certainly from a physical accessibility point of view, this is something else entirely, and it goes against everything that certainly you would be trained or wanting to protect in the physical environment. The well-being of the artist as well, that's another huge thing. I noticed the other day that her website was offline. So this could be a livelihood. She could have developed to get this would have been, you can imagine if you've got a big gig like this, you'd be extremely happy, and to go through that process and to realize that you'd made these mistakes would be huge. And I think also there's an element of the organisational thing for Spanish government. So is there going to be a potential bias now where the risk appetite has shrunk and people are going to be like, well, do you remember what happened last time? We're not going to be able to do this, might be reluctant to try again. And that's not being an apologist, that's simply stating that these are the sort of things that can add to this. And we need to encourage people to move on and into this rather than kind of all those things would then add to more cycles of exclusion. So yeah, I think it's social exclusion has a huge impact on mental health, and it's got to be stopped.
Definitely, and I think even though it was such a big scandal, I think it's also an amazing opportunity to learn and grow from it, not just for the people involved, but also externally, and hopefully it means that other organisations can look at it and see what happened, and maybe going forward can think about making their own work more inclusive. So it's such a shame that even though it did happen, I think that it will hopefully encourage others to think a bit more when putting together campaigns.
I think it will. These are the sort of situations where you can build from quite nicely, and I think if as long as the lessons are taken in the right way, and that's what we need to encourage.
I think it really also amplifies the importance of design in a competition like Huluku as well. It's an amazing step towards diversifying the online stock libraries and kind of dismantling this idea of the social exclusion. This is a way that people can, it's free, it's accessible, people can create, it is fun, it's positive. What other kind of approaches can we take to influence designers and digital artists to make more inclusive decisions like this?
But it's another good question. I tried to think of maybe this first covering up like the importance and then looking more at some practical ideas. So I've got this this quote from a chap an ant guy is famous in the 60s, 70s and 80s called James Pilditch. And back in 1969, very much a future thought leader for his area. And with a little paraphrasing, I'll just kind of cover this off. So now that design is bigger and more international than ever before, we must ask, are we ready to serve the new need? Have we the competence, the resources and the outlook they need, they being customer? But note that the requirement is for good design, not necessarily for our design. The key to success of design for it to be good at its job, able to create things people prefer. let us concentrate on international competence with universal integrity. So I thought that was a nice way of simply saying that we've got the shared vocab. This is something that it's up. The onus is really on people whose job it is and who go out there and produce these things to take on this responsibility. And obviously, back in '69, James Pilditch could see this was going to become a problem. And so how do we get closer to this ideal? So first of all, I think it's important to understand the notion of good practice, not best practice. So there's no such thing as best practice in anything. And good practice is everything, because it also, good practice leaves open the idea that we can still adapt and change and improve. So nothing we do is perfect. We should seek improvement, test, innovate, and learn as much as possible and keep that adaptable and inclusive mentality. And so a guideline might be to utilize inclusive design as which is fundamentally about designing for a minority of users who have been identified as an exclusive group. And so this also applies to usability as well. So you might find you get hot kettles and the handle's hot and you're like, why does the handle hot? Well, it's because it's been badly designed. And another thing you might come across as well is doors. So have you ever been in that situation where as you go into a door or approach a door, you pull it or push it and it shuts, and then you have to go, oh, okay. And then you have to change the motion that you're going. Not only is that going to add to the physical demands, but also it's highly unlikely to be your issue. What you then, when you look at the door furniture, is that has someone put a handle on the push side? Is the signage wrong? Is the mechanism just wrong? And there's all sorts of those little tweaks where, and as you start to design for people in mind, and you can actually alleviate a lot of these issues and design with barrier-free more in mind. So what does inclusive designer ID actually look like when applied to creative subjects? Well, it might just be worth just covering off for everybody what inclusive design actually kind of stands. And this again might be more of the American definition. In the UK, there tends to be a focus on universal design being encompassed for everything. But in essence, what you're doing is a methodology. So you go into something to design or create with an inclusive design methodology as part of your principal architectural or lens that you're looking at your piece of work with. And what you want to do is you want to isolate who can you help the most with this particular piece. Or if you're designing a piece of pottery, is it better to have usability built in? Do you want to add some, maybe make it a different shape so it's easier to hold? And so you want to isolate how you're going to improve for a particular group. And sometimes, particularly when we think about adaptive fashion, it might be that will lead to exclusion because not everybody wants to necessarily or needs to use adaptive fashion. However, what you do have is this interesting idea of what can then be taken and lessons learned that everybody can benefit from. And that's where we're starting to see things like universal design, which is more of an end result than the methodology. So what I've encouraged people to do first off, and up next I'll tell you about a tool that you can use to do this, is just think about, actually really think about what you want to achieve with this one. Don't just kind of gloss over it. Think about where you want to go. And the plan is not necessarily, as James Pilditch said, to produce something that just looks great, because actually it's got to be form over function, function over form most of the time. So don't leap straight in and then assume what's going to come out of this is going to be okay. And so an idea here would be something like the Inclusive Design Canvas. Now, this is produced by University of Cambridge researcher called Matteo Zalio. And Matteo has essentially what it is an A4, A3 piece of paper, whatever you've got. And it's all about co-design. So you'd sit there and you talk to your family, or if, for instance, you're at home with your friends, flatmates, within your business. If you're working for a client, you could do this with the client themselves. Even if you would be an artist or a potter and you're producing a bespoke piece, then you could still do the idea canvas to sit there and say, well, what can I do better as part of this design to make it, and I can co-design it with you to draw this out. And this needn't be a long process. It can be very quick. But what you would be doing is making a really solid contribution to bring things forward. So in Matteo's own words, and he describes this as, with a canvas, you can really have an opportunity to train the muscles of empathy. Think outside of the box and literally design environments that are inclusive, and they take into consideration the diversity of all human beings. So I really like the idea. It's a very simple method to apply, and you can do it at home, and all you need is a bit of paper and some pens and ideas. Now, if you're looking for something a little bit quicker, what you could do is something which I've been working on. It's called Usatili, and it's kind of like a Bauhaus movement. And what I wanted to do with this is devise a way of, it's a principle basically, that everybody and everything you do, if it's creative, you're designing something, creating something, you build in at least one accessible or inclusion idea or concept. And what you do is you then share it. So social media would be a good idea. So you tell people about what you did, why you felt it was important, and why it might be making a difference. And this then inspires others to go on, and they can use similar ideas. They can build that back into their work as well. And it's essentially, it's a free-form viral movement when it's alive and going. It's driven by everyone, for everyone, everywhere, and allows each of us to share our work and learning, and also kind of reflects about our culture. So that's the way I want people to think about, what can I do to make a difference. And to bring James Pilditch back on stage again, so he once argued that there's a relationship between inspiration and perspiration, and that's the designer's job is not just to make things look nice. So a solution he proposed was that technical and creative people should work closely together, and I guess that's what CIEDA is about. And James Pilditch was onto something in that the technical learning, or at least knowing where to ask for help, is important for everyone. So if you don't know, just dive out. And there's a lot of different ideas and lots of people thinking different things, and you can test and learn.
I think it's definitely about coming together, because there's so many people with so many different skills from so many different disciplines. And until you actually come together and have discussions and form links, like a creative person could influence like the technical person, and it's having these kind of conversations that I think is really important, and this sense of unity. And it just it kind of encompasses like who you're designing for as well. You're designing for everyone in mind, even the tiny details. And I really like the door analogy as well. You don't want to be able to have to struggle for the simple things in life. They should just be really accessible and fluid.
It's a long way to get there, and I think there's a lot to do, but it's always that first move forward. And what can we do? Start with the simpler things and build. Is usually easier to get people interested. Otherwise, people might feel a bit afraid of that committing.
So we've talked quite a lot about representation, and I wanted to zoom out of this slightly and think more about accessibility in a broader sense. I think of all the work that's still yet to be done in gallery spaces, which don't have things like large print guides, level access, ramps and lifts, audio guides, and a lot more. Even thinking about just curation and the way sometimes works are laid out, so people who are perhaps in wheelchairs can't get past them. It's stopping a whole audience of people from accessing these spaces. So what changes need to be made in legislation to accommodate everybody, and not just those with the privilege of being mobile and able-bodied?
So this is a big topic, and one that is we could probably have a separate webinar just about, and it will devolve into a massive chat. And but I think it does nicely link back to the question earlier about the potential decision within the beach scene. People don't seem to get that we're all temporarily able-bodied. It's not an if, it's a when, and I think that empathy might be something that needs to be built in to more of what we do. And so here's an example of maybe just a little story. If we all of us went out for some food and we got food poisoning, and we phoned up environmental health or the restaurant, and we would have the full weight of the government leaning down on the restaurant with the big stick of cleaning to make an impact. But if you're a wheelchair user and you're discriminated against by that same restaurant, say for instance you're refused access because there's no accessible tables, no accessible WC, no step-free access to get in, and then there's no actual weight of the government to support you. So instead the onus is on reporting, complaining and driving this is done by the individual. So that's where the kind of legislation weaknesses sit. And so you might find yourself very much alone within this process. Litigation is stressful. We're finding that's moving more to mediation, the cost of litigation, and often litigation doesn't necessarily even revolve in the right end that people are looking for. So I think when it leads us into the familiar concept of the medical and social models, which hopefully most people will have come across. So who's the problem in this scenario then? So is it the wheelchair user? Well, no, absolutely. It's of course the restaurant for not anticipating customer need and nor making any reasonable adjustments either. So we're not going to go anywhere very fast, even with like the most amazing perfect legislation that tends to take years to design, because there's a certain kind of apathy and slowness that central government tend to make. So I think it's about if the individual is viewed as the issue rather than the way society is organised. So if society is organised, then what I think I like about this is the idea of it's the organisers or the people I prefer to think of as the designers of our society, the people who make that design decision to exclude or include, and they need to make the change. And who that is will differ from person to person. So everybody needs some degree of skill with what I would describe as inclusive decision making, and technology is there to make a difference too. So one example, if we've got time, is Neatbox. This is something a chap called Gavin Neat. I won't go into too much detail. You can check it, the website. And so this is kind of changing the ball game, I guess, about how people can engage, spend their money, and participate and contribute as equally as possible. So Neatbox is the company. Gavin Neat's the social entrepreneur. And to give you an example, this might be coming back to your gallery point, that Neatbox would then essentially be an app, and I would use it and say, dear gallery, I'm going to be coming over at 3 o'clock today. This is a little about me. This is my picture. This is about how I would like to be treated. And this is a little bit about what my needs might be for when I arrive. So that from a customer service perspective, there's much more instantaneous expectation of what is expected from by the customer for the organisation or establishment. And this comes back down to the legislation's, certainly EA 2010, anticipatory duty. So, which I won't go too much detail in. But the other thing you can do outside of just being an organisation, so if any gallery owners or people who are running museums are listening to Neatbox, just reach out to them. But also, if you're just sitting there and you want to make a difference on your high street, you can actually write to Neatbox and say, this is, it's neat. So Neatebox. So Gavin Neat is where the neat comes from.
I'll drop a link into the chat for you all.
And I think Mary's coming in as well.
I've got her.
So, yeah, that's it. That's perfect. Yeah, and so the app's called Welcome Me. And the reason why this is important is because for a very low price, you can actually start to really dig into overcoming barriers by using technology. So it doesn't just have to be about the museum's really old. It's from 1600s. What do you want me to do about this? Well, here's an idea just to kick off with. And there's lots of different ways people can look at things laterally, and often accessibility can be done for free. And it's not often necessary to spend hundreds of thousands, although that is preferable if it's a big site. And what you can do with Neatbox is, as an individual, is go around your high street and say, well, actually, this I can see that shop's not got a level entry threshold. Neatbox, hi. Would you be able to contact this restaurant, this organisation, hairdressers, and say, here you go. So you can support the social entrepreneurship of Gavin and his team, but at the same time kind of push an accessibility agenda which isn't just going to be ignored by it might be, but isn't totally going to be ignored by the owner of the business.
What an amazing tool that is. Like, I didn't even know that existed. So that is really useful. I feel like there's also this perception that creating accessible environments costs a lot of money as well, which isn't always true. There's always little things you can do that will be free, I suppose. But I think the one takeaway I kind of got from that was you mentioned empathy. And I feel like people really do have to have empathy and responsibility as well in order to create lasting change, definitely.
think it certainly helps. I'd like to think anyone who's perhaps doesn't have the direct empathy will at least recognise the technical desire to make improvements and fixes. So I'm always conscious that from a personality type, or if we're engaging with different types of people, it's important to then say, well, yes, but have you seen how amazing this could look? And to give you one tiny example, as the eagle-eyed James, as he's walking around, spotted at the end of the road from here is two new builds. And they've done this ski ramp thing going up to the front doors. There's two of them. And one of them I was looking at and I thought the other one was definitely not, the gradient's wrong, it's dangerous, there's no, it's just everything's wrong about it. So I went and just made a point to the council. And actually looking back at it now, you can see after they've made the remediation that not only are there some steps, but there's a nice good gradient ramp that's leading down. It not only looks better, but it's also more functional for lots more people, from prams, and you're talking about people who might have mobility impairments. It's an improvement, and I think that's where we need to drive this from the ability to actually say, well, is the design right? No, the design was wrong, it was lazy and it was chaotic and it should never have been allowed. And it turned out, luckily, the council reinforced this, and the result is a nicer design that is now going to last for the age of the building for 75, 80 years.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think with something like a neat box, it makes it a lot easier to feel like you can do something. I think sometimes an able-bodied person, you might feel a bit helpless, and you want to be helping make these changes but don't really know where to start. So I guess with neat box you are able to make that impact, whereas before you may not have known how to go about that. So I think it's a really great resource that everyone should take a look into.
Yeah, spot on, Beth. And there will be other things like Neatbox, but Neatbox is a great start, and Gavin deserves support and recognition for what he does, and to drive his business and ideas and innovation further forward as well. So it's a nice kind of, it's a cycle of greatness as well, isn't it?
So with all of these things in mind, we've talked about a lot, from representation to design to social exclusion. What do you think is I know there's not one concrete answer, but do you think representation is a big part in order to create accessible, diverse and a more inclusive world?
I think Carmela might have hit the nail on the head. So it is one piece of the puzzle. It's not the full answer, because I don't think, as I mentioned, it's going to be a good practice. It's something we can do that adds in, and then hopefully it will just lead into more, and then someone will realise that they're really inspired by the general idea of making huge amounts of money from producing stock libraries that lots more people can use. There's a remit for just in itself, particularly if you're feeling very profit driven. So there's all sorts of cool kind of knock-on effects from this, and it's a decent piece of the puzzle, and one that I obviously feel strongly enough because we're here today and we're talking. And but I saw something on Twitter the other day that was apparently a McCarthy saying from the 50s, and the gist was that artists were the most dangerous people because they intersected with every aspect of our society. So digital art can be hugely influential and provide a ripple or butterfly effect and on how people conceptualize the way they live. And often, because artists might be thinking very future focused and putting people in and how that might look, that conceptualization can then trickle down into what everyone else is doing. And I'm sure there's tons of great examples of that happening. But imagine that, I guess, if you had a shopping high street or a mall in which there are lots of visual cues about adaptive fashion in branding, consumer marketing that's available, the POS in the windows, children growing up seeing mannequins of truly diverse body shapes, sizes and impairments in the windows as well. This is or how hard is it to find vector illustrations with characters who only have one hand or a leg? And this is ability bias. So this one's a minor pet peeve for me, because people have two hands, but not everyone does. And sure, it's that ability bias that is easy to overcome, where you just stop thinking about yourself for a moment and start thinking about what look around you, what actually is happening, and who's around you. And there's tons of that innovation and influences and inspiration just there. So that kind of leads on to another favourite subject of bias. So it's hugely important in representation, and that's why I wanted to ask people, I guess, who enter the competition to start with what they see around them. Last year we had top 3 from India, Colombia and Australia. These are places with incredible natural and human diversity. So you don't have to go very far to find something that you can bring into your work. And it could be even something very simple, like something that your neighbour does that's a cultural significance that actually is representative of where you're from. And you're like, well, that's interesting. Let me put that in there. Or why not have the correct door handles in the back of the artwork? If doors can't be operated with a closed fist, don't put it in. So think about those sort of things. Round door handles are pretty useless to most people. And so think about those tiny little things that then you could go, well, yes, but how cool is that? And there's lots of great background that you can add in, and a lot of certainly vector illustrations for commercial or business use is full of interesting things. So think about what kind of assistive technology you could bring in and add into the mix, for example. So by building that authentic representation, I guess, into your work, it gives you an easier access to making that net positive impact, Bethan, that you were talking about earlier. And this could happen across both systemic and individual change. So a couple of points that you could take away today would be, well, last year's competition. I suddenly started realizing when I was sending the emails saying where people came in positions that there were a lot from Australia. And I thought, okay, where's this? So I delved into it a little bit more, and it turned out this design school, TAFE, Design Centre Enmore, in Sydney, had been running it as a class project, unbeknownst to me. But they're doing it again this year. So what I wanted to say is that anybody out there who's got a company, an organisation, a team, want to do it at home, if you want to run a mini competition, submit and have your own rankings within there, let us know, or even just mention it on the form. And we can run that. We can even do prizes if you've got something cool going on. So the other thread is games design. Incredibly annoying to see tons of stairs in game design all the time. So what about barrier-free level design, promoting physical accessibility in this environment? Why not? Why has the future always got the same stuff we've got now? Slight complaint, but there's ideas there as well. So augmented reality, as we move into this metaverse or 3D world that's populated by the same physical environmental barriers that we already have in the real world, and they're just being transported into this 3D augmented reality. Why? Well, because no one's thinking at the moment about how they might want to do that. Obviously, there's participation elements of like the digital accessibility, but actually within the world that we exist in, we don't have to have those in there. And I'd like to see people starting to realize that the visual cues of not seeing it will transfer into the real world, where people will then be like, well, actually, you know what, I'm not going to put up with that anymore. And the other thing is, so that physical accessibility point would undermine a lot of the values, the inclusion values of augmented reality would have. We don't need this stuff. It's bad design, and good design needs to simply become design. And I know there's lots of discussion on that. And then kind of as we're drawing to a close, the movie making. So there's this film called Detective Pikachu, and Detective Pikachu is all about this, because I loved it originally. I was like, oh, Pokemons and humans living together in this one city. That's a great expression of inclusive cohabitation, transgeneration, and things like that. And as I went through the film, I started to realize that actually the Pokemon were not living in a world that was made for them. They were living in a human world, which wasn't even accessible for humans. Because if you watch it again, just check out how many times Ryan Reynolds has to hold the door open for Pikachu or other Pokemon all the time. And that's an artistic decision that's been taken. So there are decision makers who are influencing our world, or certainly the world of the Pokemon, that is easy to overcome. So I guess in short, there's a lot for us to do, and it kind of comes down to our role that as people with an interest in these subjects, we've got to inspire others to, in our society and workplace and school, to take responsibility for creating that better future as well. So every single one of us has an event or in their own creative and individual way to shape that narrative. And we can do this simply by reviewing each of the micro decisions we make. We're not there yet, so the onus needs to be on laying down what I call inclusivity tarmac for others to use. And so that, in my mind, is kind of the concept for authentic representation in digital art. So we can create this future together by using authentic representation as a starting point, and then working hard from learning from our mistakes, and then not losing confidence in that sustainable, inclusive futures.
I love what you said about inclusivity, Tarmac. I think that's a really great way to describe it. We're kind of paving the way for the future, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, because it's we all benefited from previous generations making huge changes, particularly in, say, women's rights to the 20th century. And that's inclusivity, tarmac, that's led to today. But sometimes there's people are destroying the tarmac in front of us, so you have to carry on relaying it. And that also drives the idea that you're leaving things better for the next generation, which plugs into the sustainable theory as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really great note to end on, to be honest. I think you've really summed up well what we wanted to do in this talk, and kind of we wanted to leave on the answer that yes, there's a lot of work to be done, but I guess there's always we can, help as best as we can, even just making little changes in our day-to-day lives. We can hopefully make the world a lot more inclusive. So thank you so much, James, for taking the time out of your day to talk to us. I'm so happy that we can have this conversation to bring more awareness to your creativity competition, Huluku. The link to that is in the chat right now, and it's currently inviting digital artists to submit their work to encourage more authentic representation online and rid the need of inclusive stock libraries.
Thank you, James.
Thanks, Carmela. Thanks to everyone for attending and listening.
Definitely. Thank you all. Getting loads of lovely comments as well, which is lovely. So thank you for also taking the time out for today, but not just that, but also being involved with Zealous Amplify as well. We're really grateful to have you on this journey with us, as well as us being involved and hosting this talk with you. So yeah, just thank you, and thank you for everyone for attending, and thank you, James.
No, it's been a pleasure, and I appreciate everyone's commitment to talking about something that's as exciting for me as this, and sharing that with me.
Perfect. Thank you all, and take care. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.